Hey, Old Testament folks, I'm going to try to make this our last of our intertestamental period videos. I'm going to try. That means I'm going to have to talk fast. All your questions should be answered now for your study sheet thing for the final exam. This last section here is just bonus material for having it in your notes. So I got this super duper awesome Bible Atlas, probably the best one that's out there, the ESV Bible Atlas. And that's where this thing came from, and plus the study Bible. And you put all that together and you've got yourself a super winner. And this is the color version of what you got there in your notes of a, whatchamacallit, what do we call it? Oh, synagogue, right? Okay, so you got this mikvah out here, this ceremonial washing thing. There it is. We'll be learning about those next year, 7 steps down into the thing. So people could all get washed up before they went into worship. And then you got these guys here at the entrance, always facing toward Jerusalem. They've got a special little room off to the side where they keep the law, the book of the law, and they do a big parade as it comes down the aisle. And then the pillars and support on the sides of it. You can sit either on the sides, or you can sit in the middle, blah, 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 blah. Oh, sounds like Abby's using the stapler in there. So we'll be starting right where? Oh, right here. B, the synagogue. Are you ready? Synagogue, what's the meaning of the word? Well, in Hebrew it's Bet Knesset, house of meeting, house of assembly. The modern Israel parliament is called the Knesset. Coincidence? No. In Greek, it's synagogue, which means a gathering together, a synagogue, gathering together. Same thing. So anyway, Bet Knesset would have been if it was in the Old Testament, and synagogue is what it would be in the New. Synagogue. Where did it come from? It happened during the diaspora, the scattering, when the folks were in Babylon or in Egypt. They had to have a place to worship and gather culturally to hear the word read to them so they'd know what to do when they went back and what were the consequences of them being in the land and out of the land, all that kind of stuff. So they started these little groups, a place to meet and hang out with all your Jewish friends and hear the rabbi teach you and stuff. They are very widespread in the New Testament times. They were in all over Judea. They were in Galilee. They were in, well, where are all the places that Paul went? There were some in Antioch. They were in, the Galatian churches. You find one, you find one in Corinth. You find them in Rome. You needed to have 10 men for what was called a minyan or a quorum. In Acts 16:13, you find that Paul breaks his pattern of going first to the synagogue of the Jews, and then after being rejected, going to the Gentiles. He goes directly down to the river where there's a lady praying. They think there's going to be a place of worship and prayer. They don't go to synagogue because there isn't one. There aren't enough Jews in the town. Organization of the synagogue, you got 2 main guys are responsible. First of all is the ruler of the synagogue, and I believe Jesus performs one of his miracles for one of these guys, for his son or his daughter. You check. Oh yeah, Jairus. Jairus was a synagogue official and entreated Jesus, saying, "My little daughter's at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her that she may get well and live." And she did. Yes, she did. Also, there's another one called the attendant in Luke chapter 4. The attendant brings to Jesus the scroll and says, "Will you please read today?" And Jesus reads and he says, he sits down and everybody looks at him. He says, "Today in your hearing, the scripture has been fulfilled." And everybody's like, "Oh, no way." You also have, I think the attendant is also the cantor, cantamos. The one that teaches the children, and they would do it by this kind of chanty, sing-songy thing. And we learned our ABCs this way. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q. And so you'd had the kids that would go through synagogue school, as it were, being taught by the cantor, one that would help them. They would learn the scriptures by singing them. Scribes and Pharisees often provided visiting teachers, but there weren't any resident rabbis. It was like, who would like to stand up and speak today? Oh, I see, Paul, by the way that you're dressing, you're a rabbi. Would you like to address us? And they would read then from the Old Testament in various places, and then he would stand up and give comments on it. And Paul used that opportunity to preach the gospel. Worship in the synagogue, normal order of service. You stand up and you recite the Shema Yisrael, Elohim Adonai, Elehu, whatever it is. Sorry about that horrible rendition of it. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. You'd say it standing, facing Jerusalem. Though, and get this is pretty offensive, I know, but this is how they viewed stuff. They said that women, slaves, and children were exempt from reciting it because they didn't treat them as like whole persons. You believe that? Women, slaves, and children exempt from reciting it. Well, it does mention your sons and your grandsons and stuff like that, so I guess I can understand that. Nevertheless, they would recite the Hear, O Israel first. Second, there would be recitations by a leader of the Shemoneh Esrei, 18 benedictions in some type of yearly cycle. You would need to stand for that too to be blessed. And then that was followed by the reading of the law, the Torah, and then again this would be kind of a sing-songy thing. Actually, boys, when they get their bar mitzvah, they get their first chance to sing or read from the law in the synagogue, so it's a pretty big deal. They would break up the first 5 books of the Old Testament into 52 sections-ish, read one each week. They had different cycles, though, depending on where you were. 3-year cycle for the people that were in Israel. Outside, they were reading more and more often, so 1-year cycle when in Babylon. That is typically what Jews will do now in their synagogues. 3 to 7 readers. So there's a super long section that you're going to read that day. They're going to have multiple readers, and it's kind of like an honor to get to read the scriptures. Imagine how, if we would think of it that way today. I love doing that at church, man. If ever somebody says, you get to read the scriptures, I'm like, yes, it's my favorite thing to do, just about. Levites got to go first, but then they could choose other people in the congregation that were good readers to do it. And to be a good reader, you got to give the sense, right? You got to enunciate things in the right place. You got to pronounce things the right way. You got to give the cadence and the feel. It's like poetry. They would then read from the prophets. That is the passage in Luke chapter 4 that Jesus read in the congregation. Luke chapter 4. He reads, la 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 la. The book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, and he opened the book and found the place where it was written, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are downtrodden, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. He closed the book and gave it back to the attendant, sat down, and all eyes were fixed on him. And he said to them, Today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. And all were speaking well and wondering at the gracious words which were falling from his lips. And they were saying, Is this Joseph's son? So he got to read from the prophets and then comment on it. Then there would be some type of sermon that was delivered, a la Acts 13, as Paul goes in to the synagogue there and preaches on the text that was read. Oftentimes, they would call this, in Jewish tradition, this is called the Midrash. The Jew would give their commentary on the scriptures. Eventually, these were all written out, and people would study the Midrash of Rabbi so-and-so and argue until they're blue in the face about so-and-so's commentaries, as you've read maybe in The Chosen. And then you'd be done with the pronunciation of the Aaronic blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you always. And then, service was over. But the synagogue functioned as more than just a place to meet on a Sabbath. It was also about a community place, community service. So it was where you go if you wanted to pray. It was where you'd want to go if you wanted your children trained up. It was thought of as a house of study. And it also served as a place to to carry out like synagogue discipline, Jewish discipline on sinning folks in the congregation or in the city. So officials would serve in the flogging and excommunication of folks there. We've got lots of examples of that. And then in 2 Corinthians, we got like how this was carried over to the church. The church disciplines their the members, okay, to keep them from sinning and to keep order and to keep people accountable and to bring restoration. The Jewish tradition, as far as flogging, was limited to giving them 40 minus 1, 39 lashes. Okay, transitioning back to the temple again. Who are the important people that work at the temple? Number 1, the high priest of the line of Zadok, according to 1 Chronicles 24. And then you've got the next layer out, you've got the priests who are to be of the line of Aaron. And then lastly, you've got all the Levites, and they served in various capacities. You've got some concentric circles there in your notes. So on the inside, we've got Zadok, high priests, and then the next circle out would contain the priests of Levi, and then the biggest circle is for all the Levites. After the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes, the Zadok line ceased to rule as high priests, and then it became like the highest bidder kind of thing. The high priest was appointed by whoever the ruler was at that point. Oftentimes this happened in families. They've somehow figured stuff out, had to give positions to their kids, although it's like not the way it was supposed to be. Popes in the Middle Ages oftentimes had children and would get their children appointed to certain positions, or fiddle with politics to get one of their kids to be the next pope. And you're like, wait, popes are supposed to be priests, which are supposed to be celibate. Like, I don't get that. Yeah. Hasmoneans was one of those famous dynasties, as well as the dynasty of Annas and Caiaphas. Okay. And the curious thing is that when we get to the New Testament, you have these times where there are chief priests, plural. That's weird. That's weird. There's only supposed to be one high priest, but then you got these chief priests, like a second layer, like bishops and archbishops and stuff like that. I don't know, but it was messed up. Divisions and responsibilities. The 24 divisions of David's day, as it says in Josephus, had continued on. That tradition had continued, so that there are 24 different groups that would rotate through the responsibilities probably 2 or 3 times a year. 1 or 2 weeks, once or twice a year. Okay, now we have in Luke 1 that Zacharias was of this, and it was his turn for his group to come up to go serve in the temple, and so he went there and had the encounter with an angel when he was offering up the incense. Scrolling on down. Letter C, the priests and Levites had their own residences and professions back in their Levitical cities, but were still maintained by the offerings, as the people would come in to drop their coins in there. And then you got the high priest. From the time of Herod through the New Testament period, the high priest was appointed by the ruling officials, either one of the Herods or the Roman procurator. So you basically had to suck up to Herod or Rome in order to get your position secured. And then to keep it, you just had to keep things orderly and not mess anything up. We got this guy Annas that we read about in the New Testament, held the office from 6 to 15 AD, also dominated the office until his death in AD 35 through his 4 sons and sons-in-law. This is messed up. So even though he stepped down as high priest, which is not what high priests were supposed to do, they're supposed to hold that position until they died, he retired but then controlled it through his kids. Caiaphas, his son-in-law, Jonathan, Theophilus, Matthias, and Annas the second, all his sons. And at the trial of Jesus, Jesus goes back and forth to these various folks in the upper crust. He goes to Annas. He has a trial before Caiaphas. Those are both high priests. And then he goes to Herod Antipas, and then he's sent to Pilate. So he actually has a 4 sets, 4 trials basically that one night. Temple business was referred to as the Bazaar of the Sons of Annas by later Jewish sources. We covered that in our last episode. Letter C, the high priest's power was limited by Rome, as signified by the fact that from 6 to 36 AD, his special coat and everything, and his funny hat and all that articles that he would put on were kept in the fortress of Antonia. So you're like, sir, I would like my outfit for today. And they'll be like, yeah, you're being good today. We'll give you your outfit and you can go down there and lead worship. So his duties would include things like Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, representing the people of Judea before the Roman procurator, like how they had to go and petition Pilate to take up Jesus' case. Third, presiding over the Sanhedrin, the religious political ruling body of the Jews worldwide. It was the council, as recorded in King James Version. We got several times where Jesus and his trial was brought before them, and then the apostles in Acts were brought before the council and disciplined by them and threatened and told to not preach in Jesus' name anymore. The Sanhedrin was later development of the men of the Great Assembly during Ezra's time. It was composed of 70 members plus the high priest. They met in the chamber of hewn stone, supposedly like a chamber underneath the Temple Mount. If we could go poking around, I bet we would find that eventually. But minor committees might meet elsewhere. Though in the night session during the trial of Jesus, that was a violation of the rules that were supposed to be in place for themselves. Because they're supposed to be somewhat public. They had authority over all religious and political issues of the Jews as long as it didn't contradict Roman law and taxes. Keep the peace, yo. Worship how you want to, just peaceably. Looks like I'm going to have to do a mini. No, we got like 2/3 of page left. Let's bust this out. Oral law. Most scholars today recognize that the oral law originated with Ezra and the men of the Great Synagogue after the captivity during the 5th century. And again, they tried to build a hedge, a protection of rules around the Mosaic law with additional regulations and commands to help prevent the breaking of the original command. Wash your hands, brush your teeth. These regulations were still oral in Jesus' day and are referred to by him as the traditions of the elders. Most famously in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, Jesus mentions this on, I believe, 4 occasions. He says this in verse 21, "You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder." That's the 10 Commandments. "And whoever commits murder shall be liable to the courts." That's not in the Old Testament. "But I say to you," right? "But I say to you." Here's how it really works. Jesus said, verse 27, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman to lust for her," and goes on to talk about cut off your hand and poke out your eye. "It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except for unchastity makes her commit adultery. Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, but I say to you," over and over again, he mentions these things that are now being taught in kind of like this wishy-washy way, like, here's what we say that you should do. Keep the law, yes, but keep these other things as well. Later generations then trace the authority of this oral law back to Sinai, which there's no evidence for that. This is the chain of tradition that's listed in the chapter of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, in their Mishnah, or maybe it's in their, I forget what else you call those other things. And here's what they said. "Moses received Torah from Sinai and delivered it to Joshua. And Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets delivered it to the men of the great synagogue. These said 3 things. Be deliberate in judging, raise up many disciples, and make a hedge for the Torah." And this is basically the view of the Pharisees over against the Sadducees, and became the view of the Jews in the generations following AD 70. You watch any of these movies about Jews, you got like Yentl with Barbara Streisand, or The Chosen, you got stuff like that. You see people in synagogues, a Fiddler on the Roof, there's another good one. And you got kind of these ideas being played out in the real world. Is that it? Hey, that's it. Celebrate time! You did it. It's the last one. Congratulations. That's the end of the notes. Hopefully you're ready for the test. Study those questions that we've been working on and review old tests, please. Thank you very much. We'll see you. We'll see you soon. I haven't stopped yet. Are you still watching? Well, go home. Like, turn it off. Why don't you just